When we stay in relationships and dynamics that the love is contingent on us being saved, means we'll never get to save ourselves and we'll never get to bloom. Welcome to The Shift, where we search for ways to do better by thinking better.
Whether you're going through a major life change, looking to deepen your understanding of yourself, or hoping to improve your relationships with others, The Shift is here for you.
We're your hosts, Isla and Yashar, an endlessly curious sister and brother team.
As certified brain-based executive coaches with backgrounds in medicine and management, we combine the neurosciences, performance psychology, strategic planning methodology, and mindfulness techniques to empower your transformation from the inside out.
Join us in conversation as we explore better ways to show up for ourselves and each other. Welcome back to The Shift, my friends. Today, we're starting a two-part episode that originally started on understanding the conception of victimhood and martyrdom. But as we investigated this topic a little further, we actually realized it was our relationship to belonging. We'll explain more, but what we found was sometimes we stay in certain roles or believe that we have to hide parts of ourselves or remain in certain ways to be loved. What that means for us is that as we investigated this topic, we noticed that sometimes we feel in certain relationships, we have to appear or stay a certain way to feel that connection, to feel that belonging, to be loved in that relationship. And we found that it usually could look in two ways. And that's why we decided to do an episode in two parts. So part one today is the question, do you need to stay small to be loved? This is what we'll be exploring. But to give you a sneak peek of what we mean on the opposite side of the coin, part two next week will be the question, do you need to stay strong to be loved? Now, we're not going to get into that topic today, but I want to introduce it so you better understand why we did a two-part series. So on today's topic, do you need to stay small to be loved? What does that mean? What does that mean to you? When I ask that question, what happens in your body? When I ask you that question, Yashar, what do you feel about it? Where do you feel it?
I feel like the subject matter is actually quite delicate.
Okay.
And I have two ideas running through my mind at the same time. One is, of course, calling out ourselves and realizing when we are playing a victim mindset, when we are in a martyrdom mindset, and how we can work through that and maybe represent ourselves in a way that we would feel more proud of. And then the other part of me is calling out situations where there are relationships that constantly are making one feel small or making one feel insignificant, but that almost becomes a normalized way of interacting. And so one learns to stay in that position so they are at least getting some form of attention. Of course, this is very abusive. It can be incredibly toxic, and there's not much room for evolution and growth for both parties involved. However, why I mention it and say there's a tug of war in my mind, and there's a delicate nature to this conversation, because we all have moments in our lives where we do feel like we've been victimized. We do feel like something has gone in a direction where someone's taking advantage of us. And I don't want to snuff out all the breathing room for those conversations where legitimately we need to talk about that and address that. And the literature will speak to somebody and people and groups that can weaponize that feeling. And in fact, when that becomes the mentality, they no longer actually are empathetic towards other people, and they become righteous in their own victim mindset. And that continues to cause more and more problems. So there's this like fine balance where I find myself like going back and forth in this conversation, because I want to make sure that we can speak to both carefully to address the necessity of highlighting these two parts.
Absolutely. So the truth is, we've been trying to record this particular podcast for months now, because for months I've been voice noting Yashar and my friends and like really trying to dig deep into this very fine space I'm trying to investigate. And what started this initial investigation was that I believe, from my perspective, and I'm open to discussion, so feel free to, write us and join the conversation, that victimhood and martyrdom are like cousins. They're very closely related. And what I find dangerous is most of us have had someone in some role or some culture or religion that martyrdom was romanticized. And when I sit in that a little bit, I have to question it and wonder what it's telling our neural pathways, what narratives are created that could be harmful when we romanticize the martyr. And what I mean by that is when it's outside of alignment with yourself, with your true knowing, but you believe that you will only be loved if you are this version of you, that people will only love you when you are the one that shows up no matter what, does anything no matter what, at the expense of themselves in a detrimental way. So I'm staying in that and like wondering, and then I'm wondering, does then suffering get a badge of honor? Again, it makes me curious. Then I say, oh, this is probably why we get into kind of this awful oppression Olympics, like who suffered more. And all of it, I think, is tied to this idea that by romanticizing the martyr, by suffering being a badge of honor, by putting victimhood, again, I want to stay nuanced because I really want to respect what you said, because being a victim is real, but I more mean the mindset. It's a mindset that I'm actually discussing, because what I believe is in some ways we start telling ourselves, again, reaffirming these neural pathways that believe that this is only where our worth is. And so when all of this is happening, it makes me feel that we are telling ourselves, I will only be loved if I'm a victim. I will only be loved if I stay small and need help. And I wonder, does that create an innate deficit within ourselves where we are scared to shine our brightest, be our best, fulfill our destiny, purpose, fall into deep alignment if we think that maybe that will make us disconnected from those we want to belong to and belong with, if it will disrupt our connections in our community, if we don't identify in that way. That's the question that kept coming up for months. And every time we tried to tackle it, all the nuances came up and we didn't know how to tackle it. And so now we've ended up in 2 parts. It could probably be 10 parts. But I guess when I was bringing it up, it was in this place of, again, I'm talking about a mindset versus actual pain and suffering that needs to be acknowledged, seen, and cared for.
So Isla, let's ground this conversation further and maybe provide some tangible examples so that the listeners can understand what is it that we're trying to address.
Absolutely. I can give an example. I'll give an example from our childhood because I think it actually personifies what I'm trying to say. So I think we were like 9 and 10. I'm the older one. And Yasser punched me in the face. Can you believe it? All siblings are like, yes, we can definitely believe it. And it hurt a lot. He literally punched me in the face. And I went to the mirror and you couldn't see it. So I put my mom's blush on my eye to show her that he punched me in the face. And so when I evaluate, when I'm looking at this as an adult, being like, what happened? Why did I do that? And I said, well, somewhere I believed that my pain was not enough if it couldn't be seen. This was probably never directly told to me. It was just something I processed as a young child, which became a belief system that your pain has to be so big for someone to care for you, understand it, take care of you. And even though the pain was real, I really got punched in the face and it hurt. There was something about the transition of me seeing it myself in the mirror, not seeing the markings of that, for me to feel maybe that I wouldn't be believed or it wouldn't look as bad as I felt. So I had to put this blush on. And so in that example, where are we taught that our suffering needs to be great for it to matter? It needs to be seen for it to matter. And I worry that if we are taught that on multiple levels, then we tend to, again, stay within that pain.
So what I'm hearing from you and what lands for me is the idea that when over time pain is not recognized by the people that we need support from, or we look to be supported by, we then make the pain seem bigger than it really has to be, or more apparent, so that we get the attention we want, so that we get the recognition for the pain that we want. And so if after I punched you, which wasn't the most shining example in my life, if you believed that you could walk up to our parents and say, Yashar punched me, it hurts, and they would recognize your distress and also handle the situation with me without making the situation harder or worse, then you wouldn't need to go the extra length to legitimize your pain by illegitimately adding color to your face.
Absolutely. So I actually had to play this out in real life with my son recently. My eldest got hurt. And before my youngest was born, my eldest was very quiet, like not quiet, but just didn't make much fuss. My younger came along and he like bulldozed the world. He's loud and proud and amazing, but he takes a lot of space. So slowly I've watched my eldest start to take more space too, through maybe screaming or crying, because he sees that his younger brother does it and gets attention, just because it kind of demands it when someone, throws a plate off the table or runs around the house screaming. They demand attention, and this was not part of my older son's personality. So I watched him in certain situations now make a lot more noise, and I noticed that in one situation he got hurt, but his cry was exaggerated. And so I had to take a moment and recognize that first and ask the question, this might be a situation in which, yes, he got hurt, but he also might subconsciously believe that he has to cry that loud to be cared for or to demand attention in a situation that his younger brother usually has the spotlight on him. So what did I do? I talked to him and I said, hey, Sash, buddy, this sucks. I am so sorry you got hurt. I want to tell you this. You want to cry? You can cry any time you need to cry. Loud, quiet, it's all good. But if you think you have to cry like this for mommy's attention, I'm telling you, you don't. If you need my attention, just ask at any time if I'm not giving it to you. And for me, it was an active moment of trying to change this moment and this imprint. So it's not that crying loud or quiet or anything is bad. Again, we don't do good and bad, but in general, there's nothing wrong with crying at any volume. I just didn't want him to believe he had to do that for the attention. And part of that was because I went back to my child self example, remembering how I felt. And so I just named it in that situation to say, if at any time you need my attention, just ask. If you have big emotions and you want to express them, feel free. But one does not have to equal the other. In other words, you don't have to do a big fuss to think that's the only way to get my attention. And that's the kind of reframing that I think is important, so that the imprints aren't about that I will only care for you if you're in pain. Like my care for you is always an unconditional. If you're in pain, we will definitely recognize it. But if you just need time, space, and attention, that is valid in and of itself.
I personally can relate to the last two examples of needing to make something stand out more to get attention or to have my feelings validated. I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, we had a family over and they brought their young son. And for whatever reason, I don't remember why now, I just didn't really like the young man. And and I don't even know why. I don't know if he did anything at all, but it just, as a child, I just felt like I didn't resonate. And I didn't know how to express that, or at least I didn't feel like I could express that. And so what ended up happening is I like festered in these emotions all night as this family stayed for dinner and, as kids played. And then I remember watching him go towards a big Lego ship that I built that I was actually very proud of, that was sitting on a table in our room. And I remember him about to go pick it up, and I had the idea to stop him. I was like, I'm going to just tell him to, no, don't touch. That's really important to me. But then the feeling came over me that, wait a second, I have a feeling he's going to do something destructive. And if I just wait long enough, he will. And then I can blame him for the destruction. And then everyone will come to everyone will come to my understanding of how awful and rotten this young man is. This is a this is a 7, 8 year old brain. And so I waited, and I was right. My hypothesis came true. He destroyed this ship that I worked on that I was very proud of, and it went in cracks and crevices behind the desk it was on, and it was hard to get the pieces out. And I was very frustrated, though almost relieved, because now is my chance to go and tell everyone, tell the adults, look, I was right. This boy is no good. And what ended up happening was nothing. I was told that you don't need to make a big deal about this. I was told that it's okay. He's a guest and he was just playing and he didn't mean to, and to let's move on. And so it's a really interesting example about this idea of feeling this victimization of a situation, because it started by me not feeling that anyone would take my insecurity in the situation seriously. And therefore, I wanted the situation to get worse. I almost like called it into reality. And when it did, I ended up right where I began, if not worse, because now I actually have legitimate proof about something. And still, it's like, it's okay, let's just move on. And so this really brings me to the idea of what you spoke to earlier in the podcast, Ayla. It's about connection and belonging. When we are in this space where we feel that we are not connected to or belong to, especially in intimate relationships, we then have to justify ourselves in that relationship.
Mhm.
And so there's many dangers to this, of course. I'm curious if you have an example, Ayla, of how if we take these pains that start young and move the evolutionary timeline forward into adulthood, what that looks like in an adult relationship.
One of the main ways we see it is people pleasing in general. Like that was you, like young, being taught to people please. And that's what I mean. Like victimhood, martyrdom, people pleasing, these are all relatives. They're all kind of manifest in different imprints within ourselves, and they show up in these ways. But I think ultimately, again, reiterating what we both just said, it's about connection and belonging, and how we assess out these relationships and be like, okay, how can I connect to you? What are you valuing? You value my light or my pain or my strength or like my weakness. And then you kind of make yourself shapeshift to be that in that relationship. And that's when it gets dangerous, especially because from a young age, you've been told, well, your pain is not that important. It's okay. He was a guest. Like, when that acknowledgement never came to you. So that story was told to you, and then you'll see it evolve where it's hard for you to take space. It's hard for you to be big. It's hard for you to validate your own feelings. You're gaslighting yourself, because those are the imprints that we see. So again, you ask what it looks like in adult relationships. It looks like people pleasing. It looks like self-gaslighting. It looks like not being able to take space, stand in your power, stay in your alignment, not being able to set boundaries, and this concept that other people's needs and desires are more important than our own. And that does not mean we're not compassionate and generous and kind. What it means is that we have a deep understanding of what our values are and how to align with those, and to stay in our knowing as we are compassionate, kind, and generous. Again, it's a mindset shift. It's asking, what's the root? What's the reason you're doing this? Is it because it's in deep alignment with who you are and your values? Or is it because you believe if you don't do this, you won't be loved? That's a different situation. The same act could have two different reasons. And that's what I'm asking us to question these days. So personally, in adult life, how I have seen this manifest is that I have certain relationships that thrive when I'm suffering. I had to do a deep look into these relationships to realize when I am fractured, these people comes through like a superhero. They show up, they support you, they do anything they can to be there for you, which is amazing, which is what most people want. It's like people to show up when you're suffering, But what I noticed in those same relationships, some of them, is when I was thriving, our relationship fractured. And I was curious. When I am in the depths of my despair, they're a hero. And when I start to be whole and shine and be strong, we're in conflict. And so that made me start questioning this topic we're on today, which is, do you need to stay small to be loved? Because this is a type of relationship that is so dangerous because it looks beautiful on the outside and you want to stay in that love and that protection, in that ride or die. But when I noticed that it was not there or not there in the same way, when I was whole, when I was in my light, when I was in alignment, it made me start questioning things, because that for sure means it keeps you small, because it reaffirms to you that your worth is in your weakness, because that person needs to be a savior and hero. And when they are no longer the savior and hero in the relationship, they're no longer interested in you. So if you're trying to maintain that relationship, what does that mean? You can't be bright. And that to me is why I want to talk about this topic. That to me is what I think a real danger is when we are trying to maintain partnerships, relationships, community. Our connection cannot be pain only. It's going to be part of life, but it can't be the only connection we have is through this savior complex connection, through a trauma bond. That can't be the only ties we have that keep us together, because that means that I can't grow, evolve, bloom, be strong, thrive, stand in my light, because that will scare you and you will feel that you are no longer of service to me. And that's what I'm scared of, is that when we stay in relationships and dynamics, that the love is contingent on us being saved, means we'll never get to save ourselves and we'll never get to bloom.
In your story, I hear recognition of that slippery slope of moving into the space where you stay small. And then I also know and recognize that because you saw that pattern, changes were made. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Many times that doesn't happen. Or even if there's a recognition, there's not a trust or a belief or maybe a internal strength to change the relationship, walk away from the relationship, call out the relationship. So before we go into tools about how to do that work, I think it's also important to highlight what happens if the recognition is not there. What happens if someone stays in the victim mindset, if someone stays in the martyrdom, if someone stays in the identity, I must be small to be loved. So as I go through some of these identification points, think about them and ask yourself, where do you fall on the spectrum of these points? Just so maybe a little bit more understanding or recognition can be brought forth for you. The first one is a little bit like a chicken or egg story. We kind of gave examples of our childhood and how this could be brought about. And then Isla, you gave an example of adulthood, and many adult relationships, I think, can have that fine line or theme running through them. But the chicken or the egg is this: do I believe the outside world has more control of what happens to my life, or do I believe I personally have more control of what happens? And why I say it is a chicken or an egg is because we are shaped very young, and then these are parts of our psychology that grow with us, but not necessarily change. So in science terms, they call it external locus of control. And the external locus of control is what brings a perpetual victim mindset to light. What allows for a victim to stay a victim in their mind is they believe that the outside world, the outside environment, the outside people have more control on what happens to oneself than they do on themselves. They're at the mercy of these people or these environments. So when someone's in the state, the tricky part is then they're constantly seeking recognition for being in a victim state. And so there's this preoccupation of constantly looking out for others to recognize that there's a victim here, that there's something that is hard, wrong, that there's something that is broken. And without that recognition from the other, then the person tries harder to show that there's a problem. Again, an example, as you said, Isla, you were a victim of my punch, and you then try to show it bigger by putting blush on the parts that hurt. when this continues down this path and it's not checked, almost ironically, though you're looking for empathy, the victim becomes less empathetic towards other people's suffering. Like what you described, Isla, earlier as the oppression Olympics, this competitiveness around whose suffering is more important and whose in group is more valid in their suffering than others. And with that comes this moral elitism, this idea that you are doing your best and trying your hardest and maintaining a positive self-image of yourself by like, I work really hard and the world is making it harder for me. The people are still making it harder for me. So you start to encase yourself in this me or us versus them mentality. You become more like, I'm doing so good and no one is recognizing me and everyone else must be evil because of it. And finally, this brings about the idea that you are in a place where you're constantly thinking about the times where you've been a victim. And so therefore your mentality, your focus points are all on past experiences that again justify where you're at. And as you can see, as I will go down some of these main points that happen with people when they enter into this external locus of control and this victim mindset, everything the brain does is to protect oneself's identity, but also lift oneself in thinking they're correct in this identity. So we have to find some tools to be able to cut through this. We have to find some tools that are able to change or break the cycle of thinking and feeling. Though again, as we said from the onset, it's legitimate sometimes why one would step in this place.
Absolutely.
And also, we have to be able to, as adults, find ways to work through it and not just stay in this way of thinking, because ultimately it will only bring you closer to your pain and to others who see your pain in that way, but it doesn't necessarily provide a solution to that pain. And I think that's the dangerous place that we're calling out in this episode. And maybe right now is a good time to talk about how we can break through that cycle and provide some tools so that the pain is recognized and we can evolve through it and past it.
Absolutely. Again, you will see this as people pleasing. You will see this as anxiety. You will see this as self gaslighting. You'll see it as different forms of PTSD. This will show up in your life in different ways. And it's all because at the root, there was probably a series of years, lifetimes, who knows, that you felt that you were not seen, heard, and understood. So none of this is to take away from that very real pain that was not recognized and was not witnessed and understood at a level where you felt worthy, where you felt seen. This is all valid and true for all of us. But this conversation, like you were saying, is about more. It's about you empowering yourself to not have to stay there, to know that your worth isn't tied up to that time, place, contract narrative, that your worth and alignment is and can be in you thriving. And that is not something you should dismiss. We are doing ourselves a disservice by showing up as like discount versions of ourselves. And we need to create new neural pathways, new experiences, new relationships where you are worthy of care, even when you're thriving. So this becomes kind of the so what now what of it all, which you heard on our previous episode. So how can we create new neural pathways that allow us to build inventory around success, around celebration, around joy, around being supported at all times, even in our glory? That's the first question. I think another major part is looking who is there for you in the light as well as the dark, obviously, but does not get scared of your light. Do an inventory of your community. That is critical to a strategy forward. Another great example is getting to know the parts of yourself that you love, the parts that you feel are most aligned with you, make you most excited, the version of you that makes you most proud of yourself. I think part of this work is getting to know yourself in that way before you can even introduce it to someone else. So ask yourself those questions. What do you find most inspiring about yourself? What makes you proud of yourself? What does it look like when you are shining at full wattage? What does success look like? What does thriving feel like? If you could create your most ideal, like-hearted community, who would it be? Where would it be? When you see yourself as abundant, what changes? These are all just examples of questions in that getting to know you process of you understanding the version of you most aligned with your values, your purpose. And the more you get to know them, the more you understand who in your community, what partnerships, what actions, what behaviors, what mindset will allow that to bloom. And so you won't need to stay small to be loved, because you will understand what thriving looks like and feels like, and you will create authentic connections that support that growth. Thank you for listening, friends. What shifted for you during this episode? We'd love to hear your insights. Write us with any questions, commentary, or episode ideas at theshift@mindshiftleadership.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, we would deeply appreciate a like and subscribe.
The Shift is brought to you by MindShift Leadership, a heart-centered, evidence-based, mindset-powered leadership company, empowering you with the training to prioritize mental health, inclusion, and performance optimization.